You are live. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome aboard, and we're here for our 64th episode of What is Truth? I'm John Barnwell here in the Motor City in the US of A, and I'm here with the Reverend David William Parry in the Crown City of London in good old Britain, now known as the UK. And it's an interesting synchronicity, shall we say, that today is the 64th episode. That's quite a journey. And I see that quite a few of you have followed us along this somewhat perilous journey into the world of ideation. And what kind of riddles can we serve up to provide us with food for thought as we meet the challenge in today's oftentimes, most always actually lately, peculiar world in which we're living, in which falsehood is the norm of the day. They don't want us to know anything, so consequently, those that were resourceful figured out how to know everything, and that has created quite a conundrum for the powers that be, which is interesting to see it unfold and rattle their cages. And so I started thinking about this, and a friend of mine who was living in Amsterdam teaching Aikido, but now apparently I guess he's moved back here. But we got into a exchange regarding the shamanism of Central Asia and the traditions of the Tungu and all of that. That gets very interesting because that gets into the Wu, which is an ancient Chinese concept that, as of late, as many people realize, has been co-opted by Cliff High on his podcast elsewhere. And he never seems to touch on, maybe I missed those episodes because I'm not really a religious follower of his, although I'm quite impressed by certain things that he manages to come up with. But when he starts talking about Wu, yeah, of course, Wuhan. Yeah, but Wu is an interesting subject, and it kind of dovetails with this episode because this is the 64th episode, and there are 64 hexagrams in the I Ching, which was the commentaries of King Wen on the hexagrams that were observed on the tortoise shell as the Bakwa, the original series of trigrams, and through permutation with 3 above and 3 below, they become hexagrams, and of which there's 64 possibilities in the series. And so that's an ancient system of knowledge and divination that extends back way back into the early history of Chinese culture, and extending back to the incarnation of Lucifer in China that happened in the 2nd millennium BC, and Christ incarnated at the turning point of time, a little over a couple thousand years ago. And currently we're going through the balancing event to the incarnation of Lucifer in China, which will culminate in the incarnation of Ahriman, of the spirit of darkness. Just as Lucifer is if you get into Kabbalistic understanding of Lucifer and the commentaries by scholars of Hebrew, it refers to a being that is brazen, and that brazenness of Lucifer is that he's like a mirror, that he reflects the light. He is not that light, see? He reflects that light. He's a light bearer. And the spirit of Ahriman is the spirit of materialism, the spirit of darkness and materiality. And it's due to the influence of Ahriman, and according to esoteric Christianity, that we have these dense physical skeletons so that we can actually walk around in these physical bodies and not be puddles of jelly. So that there's, and likewise through the intervention of Lucifer as depicted in the story of the Garden of Eden with the story of the apple with Adam and Eve, that's the event that brought us into a denser existence in the middle of the Lemurian period. But it also brought us into knowledge of good and evil. And it's interesting because it centers around the serpent giving the apple to Eve. And there's people that try to comment about the Bible, like our friend Leo. I don't know why, but for some reason he seems to think that Lucifer and Satan are just different names of the same being. And that has been a Miltonian error that's existed, almost all the commentaries on the Bible make that mistake. But if you get into some of the earlier commentaries they knew, I mean, you could see books from the early period of bookmaking with woodcuts showing, I've seen this woodcut, and it shows two pictures of two heads. The one's Lucifer and the other one's Satan. So they're not the same being. And because mankind obfuscates that distinction, they can't get a clear picture of the challenges that we're meeting. And they misinterpret, like referring to Blavatsky as satanic. No, she's not satanic. She's Luciferic. And she proclaims it basically. The Luciferic, there's different senses in which it can be expressed. And the Luciferic is that ancient wisdom stream that preceded the incarnation of Christ. And because of the opposition to the divine plan, had Lucifer not intervened, we would end up evolving into being extremely well-behaved puppets of the Hashem. That's basically the interpretation of esoteric Christianity. Hashem being the Jewish honorific name for Jehovah Elohim, the being that is depicted in the Old Testament, the lunar Elohim that was responsible for generation of, this whole story of Adam and Eve. What is it? It's a narrative regarding the beginning of procreation, right? And so what is that? Well, when you get into that apple image, it's interesting because if you translate the word apple into Latin, it's a word malum. And malum means evil. And so you have, like, for example, New York, the Big Apple. Well, I guess it would be the magnum malum, the big evil, which actually is quite an apropos description if you know anybody that knows anything about New York politics and Tammany Hall and that whole nest of vipers in banking and corporate superstructures and on and on and on. It's like the international city of the world in many regards. And so it's like that's where the castle of Klingsor is, that's the headquarters of Darth Vader's dark empire on Earth. You know, that's like, yeah, there's other things. There's Washington, and there's like secret bases in Nevada or whatever. But really, the nervous system of this subnature technic is so much involved in its power structure in New York. Yeah, there's Silicon Valley. It's out in California. Okay, so what? That's a bunch of kids that they let run things, you know, because the people whose names you don't know that really run things, more of them tend to be in New York. And so it's funny how I get off on these tangents that I never intended. But when you get into looking at this, and it's quite fascinating, because what are we going to do about all this? You know, that's the thing I'm always thinking about. What can I do to like provide leaven so that we can raise this up to a higher vibration, and a spiritual leaven, so to speak. And when I started looking at these things, and I was talking to my friend who's on social media, who's the Aikido instructor who taught in Amsterdam, and I started thinking, you know, because there's an interesting connection there, because, well, he's a Aikido instructor. I studied Aikido for many years. Cliff High studied Aikido for many years. So there's this like Aikido connection. But see, Aikido's Japanese, okay? And Wu is Chinese. But there is a connection there, because if you get into some of the fascinating work that's been done in ethnography and linguistics, specifically, I didn't even think I was going to be talking about this, but I will dig it up while I'm talking. And let's see here, I won't bother with that, because I don't even know where I put it. But anyways, to get into understanding the concept of Wu is the important point, and I think we'll have to approach it again later, because it's much better when you contextualize these things. But in getting to understand Wu, when Cliff talks about it, it has to do with things that you can't see, that are unapparent, that all of a sudden finding about things that you didn't know were there. And so he uses that as a blanket for these undiscovered territory that he tries to make reference to. But if you get into the studies of shamanism and all that, there's whole papers written on, is it accurate to translate Wu as shaman? And because shaman is a Tungu word, okay, and a shaman is a specific. It's like for example, in the American Indians, they have the medicine man. A shaman is like the medicine man, in that he's the guy entrusted with being an oracle of sorts. So that in China, that kind of a role would be somebody who would be the person in charge of the I Ching, the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching. That would be preferably handled by a master, a Wu master. But see, when you get into that, and it has layers and layers of depth, and Americans, perhaps even more so than the Brits, don't really know much, next to nothing. I mean, they don't know about China for nothing, you know. And so the example was when the representative, after Nixon opened up China, and then the representative came here, and one of the American diplomats said to the Chinese diplomat, he said, "So, what English books, American books, have you translated into Chinese in recent years?" And he said, "Jonathan Livingston Seagull." He said, "And that's it?" He said, "Well, can you name any Chinese books that you've translated into English in the last few years?" And the diplomat, who's supposed to be a diplomat, right? He couldn't think of one, you know. I mean, yeah, there's the Yellow Emperor and all that, but he didn't have the presence of mind, or perhaps he never heard of it. But I thought that's kind of funny, and so that's how distant we are from the region of thought that's inhabited in China, which has to do with the extension of the Mongolian subrace of Atlantis, the seven subrace, so that there's this very deep magical culture involved with the Mongolians, and also with the sixth subrace of Atlantis. And so when you get into the Central Asian mysteries, you're getting into some very, very deep territory, of which American scholars know next to nothing. You can only find a few papers in English on the subject of the Tenghu shaman of Central Asia, or the concept of Wu. There's next to nothing. But that being said, that's interesting because a very dear friend of Douglas Gabriel, my good buddy from American Intelligence Media, him and Tyler is doing all that magnificent work. And he did a podcast the other day on the relationship of anthroposophy, or Rudolf Steiner's work, to Buddhism, which is very, very interesting because he traces it all the way back into archaic traditions of Buddhism, dealing with the Nirmanakaya, the Sambhogakaya, and the Dharmakaya, which are the three levels of embodiment of bodhisattvas, which is the whole series of 12 bodhisattvas is tied into Gautama Buddha. And the bodhisattvas receive their inspiration from the Adi Buddha, the primal Buddha, which, and if you get into the Tibetan tradition, you got Chenrezig or Avalokiteshvara, but these are referent to the being of Vishvakarman, which, if you follow my podcast here, you'll know that Vishvakarman is the title or name of the solar logos, according to the ancient traditions of Stone Age India. So that we're seeing something that's very much rooted in the depths of the past, and so we see that the Vishvakarman was the being that was just beyond perception, that was being referred to by the Manu or Noah, is one Manu form in the Old Testament. And so you get into the understanding of the Sun Mystery Center in ancient Atlantis, whereas in the Mongolian stream, what you have is the Mars Mysteries. And in these Mars Mysteries, they migrated into Central Asia as a very specific stream and impulse. And so you have that traveling across the Bering Straits and down into Canada and US. Of course, it wasn't Canada and US when they went there, but what would eventually become that. They traveled across there. And that's that Mars stream within the American Indians. And then when they got further down, they ran into the Toltecs. And the Toltecs are a people that, according to their own tradition, and I verified this in my conversations with Thomas Ben-Yakya, who was the spokesman for the Hopi elders regarding the Book of the Hopi and the Hopi tablets and all that kind of stuff. And he concurred. He said, yes, the Hopi are a branch of the Toltec, and we came from Atlantis. But we came from the east. See, these other tribes came in through Alaska from Siberia, and we taught them how to grow corn. So there's a total connection there. Excuse me for a second. Well, I shouldn't eat all that ice cream in any regards. So you see that there's this connection there, and it's that the Saturn mysteries of the Toltec with the Mars mysteries of the Mongolian stream of Indians. And there's also that Lemurian impulse that comes up through South America. And so things are far more complex than anyone would consider. I mean, you can find that there's, with the new studies in genealogy, they're starting to realize that in the islands in the middle of the Pacific, they're finding bloodlines leading back to ancient Persia and East Africa. You know, it's like there's all kinds of connections there. So you see that the world's been an international place for a long time. And you can't see all these civilizations as being isolated events. But so anyway, so what I did was I went on and on about a topic I really wasn't intending on speaking on, but I looked up there and I saw that number 64, and I thought I'd bring it up. And I have a little more I could share on that that's extremely interesting. But I wanted to say and give my greeting to Reverend David in London. How are you doing there, David?
Always good to see you, John, and I trust you're felicitous. Gosh, you've got so much into the opening. I don't know where to start. I know a thing or two about Central Asia. In fact, I wrote an article on Tengri and Tengrism for the Open Central Asia magazine a couple of years ago. You've got to remember, don't say nice things. Well, two things. Don't say nice things about China and Central Asia. If you want to survive the afternoon, don't say nice things about China and Central Asia. They're very old and they're used to their neighbour and they're not happy. Put it that way. They're not happy. Well, I'll give you an anecdote. I mean, I was in the middle of the University of Osh, which is Kyrgyzia, one afternoon a couple of years back, and the Chinese cultural attaché was in the room. You could tell it was him because he was on his own one side of the room and all the Central Asians were stood on the other side of the room. So I thought, oh God, that's not nice. So I went over and talked to him. And they're not only reviving the Silk Road, they want super fast trains to get from Beijing to the capitals of Europe over the next couple of years, and they're in the process of doing it. They were talking about robotic trains that didn't need drivers and built each other. And I said, oh, that sounds intriguing. And then he said, yes, they're all speaking, because it's already started. The trains are speaking to each other in a language that nobody understands. And I said, don't you find that a bit worrying? And you could hear the mumbling from the other side of the room from the Central Asians, because of course it will go through their countries first, so they're not happy. Central Asia is so old, you've got to be really careful. I mean, Buddhism is this new exotic religion in Central Asia. It doesn't cut any mustard with them at all. If you say 3,000 years, babies. And the shamanism goes back forever. Even Kublai Khan. I mean, when you're looking at that dynasty of Chinese rulers, the powerhouse behind it all in the imperial city, of course, was actually shamanism, not Confucianism, and not Taoism. People tend to forget that. And there were shaman employed by the imperial palace to conduct daily rituals for the safety of the emperor and so on. Magic is part of the life of that part of the world, or at least what we call magic. I mean, I think it's a lot more complicated over there. And certainly it was unwise to think that most other systems are comparable. I mean, there are very clear academic reasons for saying shamanism as a term belongs to that part of the world. Although I agree, yes, you're looking at experts like the Wu. I hadn't heard of this guy or his show. Does that show I'm a mere Brit? You must tell me more about that in a minute. I used to love my Carl Jung's book on the I Ching. I used to, Richard Wilhelm, who did the translation. I also loved my Secret of the Golden Flower, how the Taoists generate internal energy currents to become immortal, until I realized certain chapters had gone missing. What is Jung worried about? That we all become immortal or something? Just keep them in. The one thing that really irritates David is if you're going to translate or work on a foreign text, please keep the information in and let people make their own mind up. Please don't do that. And for someone of that stature, I thought it was just bizarre, let alone anything else. And which does that lead to Amsterdam? In my case, possibly not. Although I've always wanted to live in Amsterdam. I mean, one of my dreams in the past was to elbow out the present residence of Rembrandt van Rijn's old apartment so I could live there. That's a personal fantasy. No, I mean, the hexagrams, the Adi Buddha, I mean, that's possibly comparable to Gnostic views of the ultimate. I mean, there do seem to be parallels there. I mean, if you're talking about the Bythos, that seems to be on a conceptual level comparable with the Adi Buddha, the Tathagatagarbha, the founding principle, the Buddha of Buddhas. There seems to be something there that you can work with. But, I think you've got to have a lifetime to get through these things unless you follow Hermann Hesse's advice. Someone asked him how you became a Buddhist, and he said, move to India. I said, we can see what he's getting at. Otherwise, what's it Hamlet says? Words, 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 and you're not doing it. I mean, the point of being a Buddhist is to walk the path. The point of being a Christian is to be on your knees and saying your prayers, which is why my knees are given out nowadays. It's the doing as well as the conceptualizing, and I'm not minimizing the conceptualizing one moment. I think it's all absolutely vital and a distinguishing characteristic, a beautiful characteristic of the world we currently live in. But we've got to remember the doing as well. I mean, I think without that, we get the glamour that Alice Bailey's talking about, where fantasy is basically holding us back, ruling the coop. I mean, that's false light. So you're on some weird level, you're involved in a personal fantasy, which you think is Christianity or Buddhism, but all right, next week you want to be Iron Man, or next week you want to be Thor, because it's not real. You're not really doing it. I mean, I'm mesmerized by TikToks, I confess it. And a lot of the people going around with those Funko Pop things, I mean, God's sake, sort of little puppet things with a big head and a small body. And I noticed lots of the adherents of this particular phase of adolescence, most of whom are in their 40s, bloody grow up, progress in your career and become a responsible citizen, not going around collecting Funko Pops. The opening line invariably is, look at my stuff. And then you see this basement full of Funko Pops and DVDs. And oh, my God. But, and there are weird comparative rituals. Like you've got to show your Funko Pop that's the most scary and one that's the most sad and one that's the most happy or something or other. And you think, God, I mean, it's very dangerous to live in a world of unchecked fantasy. And my worry is that that's increasingly happening under the sort of deceptive lights of the Luciferian principle. Somebody said to me grimly a couple of years ago, isn't the world so harsh now that people are just retreating into their fantasy lives? I mean, there is some truth to that, but surely human beings are capable of so much more than that. No matter how hard your life has been, and some people have had some very hard lives, let's face it. Some people have been surrounded by sickness and mortality, and if their balancing factor is found in watching game shows and fantasy, good on you. Good on you. You found a balance, you found a way to deal with the sadness, and you've got a bit of happiness in your life, good on you. But let's work on the premise that that's not the describing factor of most people's lives, in which case they're cutting themselves incredibly short from what it is they could achieve, from what it is they could experience, from the joys and the imaginative heights they actually could achieve. So that's me on Amsterdam. Because my fantasy is to live in Amsterdam. It won't happen. But there we are. I suppose that's me being the realist as well. I know it won't happen. It's a nice fantasy. Yeah, I mean, Chinese mysticism, I looked at it a bit, but not as much as my beloved Central Asia. I mean, you get very aware. I mean, for instance, Tengri, if you travel in most parts of Central Asia nowadays, they'll tell you very clearly it's one of the names of Allah. So, and then another raft of things opens, like, what do you mean by Islam? And right, okay, the room has locked doors. What do you mean by your version of the imams? And it goes on and on and on and on. It's the diversity and the depth of that part of the world, which, since we're speaking about types of balance at the moment, which balance against the really genuinely magical and the mystical heights and depths they've managed to achieve, which for me has always made that part of the world so genuinely enchanting, and that's a deliberate choice of the word. And some, a region that needs to be better known. Particularly, of course, I'll say something controversial and hand back to you, John. Since the Chinese not only appropriate Tibet every couple of centuries, it is not historically true that Tibet has always belonged to them. I'm sorry. It is not historically true, as far as I know, that John Cena is working for the Chinese government. Even though I love the present photographs of him looking like Chairman Mao. They're very funny, but let's not be nasty. He's making a career move. He's not a member of the party, at least as far as we all know. And in Central Asia, it's not true, Chinese government, that these regions have always been dominated by the emperors, by the khans. It's just not. So we need to be a little more sensitive to the richness. I mean, a dear friend of mine, I'll just finish with this bit. I'm trying to think of a couple of good examples. I mean, the Soviets came along and they did a lot of good things as well as a lot of bad things. They did a lot of bad things. But they managed to give these countries a sense that they wanted to keep their cultural treasures, which was an unexpected development on the part of the Soviets. That's not what they were planning at all, but that's what happened. And some of my friends, I know some very great poets in that part of the world, who are adamant and ardent that say something like the Kazakh language and Kazakh culture needs to be revived for the good and the spiritual depth of the people that are over there, that thrive through their own spiritual roots. I'll hand back with that, John, because that's a subject that could just go on forever. I do think we need to look at the difference between Lucifer and Ahriman, because that is just theological ignorance of the first order, and it should have been addressed by the church in every century, which it hasn't been, which to everybody's detriment. I mean, there were theologists in every century that were perfectly aware of that distinction. The fact it's never been on anybody's agenda, I find absolutely outrageous, because it's the job of the church to speak on these matters and pronounce on these matters. But anyway, that's me getting into home territory. I'll hand back to you. And what do you make of that, John?
Yeah, I mean, Pope John Paul II, for example, he was very aware of the distinction as he studied Rudolf Steiner. I mean, I was in a discussion with my friend who ran for governor of Connecticut, right? And he studies Steiner and Joe, and he gets into some interesting perspectives on many of these things. And really, when you get into it deeper, like with my friend, the Aikido instructor, Robert Allen Pittman, and the conversations that we've gotten into recently, there's this ethnologist, I guess you would call him, anthropologist, linguist. He works through a lot of different related fields. He's Russian. Most of his stuff is published only in Russian, but some has been translated in English, and it's quite excellent, actually. But his name is Sergei Mikhailovich Shirogorov, and he's the guy in Tunguistic studies, or I guess is what you would call it here in English, and the study of the Tungu and the social organization of the Tungu and their shamanistic traditions and all of that, but see the understanding in the West of shamanism is largely comes out of the work of Mircea Eliade and that whole really that's kind of a psychological school of thought, but it does point out certain distinctions, that a shaman is a person who can speak to invisible beings. That's a very clear designation. And that is something that is shared with this whole idea of woo. And, one of our guests here is, he's letting me, Human Sense is letting me know that woo translates to metaphysics, the mother of all sciences. Cliff's understanding of woo as everything we stuff into our shadows of denial fits the bill. Well, yeah, I'm well aware of what he says about woo, but I have yet to have seen him bring up the topic of the word that's translated WU. He does woo with two O's, like woo woo. When somebody's talking about woo woo, means they're talking about, ghosts or metaphysical, speculations and all that. It's very, very much kind of a cut down. Oh, you're going into woo woo. And so he co-opted the word, but just one word, woo, W-O-O, but there is an actual Chinese word, W-U, and that's woo. And the ideogram, well, I don't want to get into ideograms and all that because that wouldn't mean anything to anybody anyways, but I got into talking briefly about my former partner who in the last few years passed on, who is the international full contact karate champion of the world. And he decided to retire from karate to focus on managing the Amboy Dukes with Ted Nugent and Dick Wagner and the Frost, two of the premier guitar players of the 60s. And so as a result of him retiring from that, Chuck Norris won the following year and became famous. But whereas the previous year, Bobby had defeated Chuck Norris and won the title. So it's a matter of speculation. Would Bobby have defeated him again had he not retired? And maybe Bobby could have become famous in the movies, whatever. So it's kind of funny looking at these things. But Bobby, one of the things that very few people are aware of, other than a few of his close friends here and other people who refer to him as Karate Bob, but is that he introduced the Wu form of Tai Chi Chuan to America. And the Wu has to do with the Wu family, and that there is a family that is traditionally the instructors of the emperors, the Wu family, the leading representative outside of China, outside of Hong Kong, really, because the family moved to Hong Kong. They're a very wealthy family in Hong Kong. But Eddie Wu was the member of the family that came to North America, lived in Toronto, and was teaching Tai Chi Chuan there. And he convinced Eddie Wu to send his principal Western student to America to open Tai Chi Chuan schools in America. And so he sent Steve Britt. And Steve, an old friend, he's since passed on also. But in reference to what Bobby says about the Wu form of Tai Chi Chuan, he says it's referred to as the supreme ultimate, is that the emperor had to have the best form of Tai Chi Chuan so that he would be at a higher level than anybody that might be around him. So you have all the various forms of Tai Chi Chuan, and then you have Kung Fu, and you started talking about the Khans. Yes, the Khan is very much tied into that whole tradition of Tengrit and Tengrism, and people who don't know what that is, that's the Central Asian sky god, and it's quite a deep study, difficult study to get close to, but in getting into who's good sources for that, Shiriko Gorov is the best source that I know of in English, and he's written some interesting things regarding. Let me dig at this one thing up here. Shamanism theory of. Let's see. I have to dig in here. Excuse me. How impolite. Let's see. Where is it? See, I download so many things, it's sometimes hard for me to. But well, anyways, I'll spell his name and you can do your own research. I shouldn't be doing all you folks' research for you. It's SHIROKOGOROV. And you could find things on academia.org, anybody who wants to take it further. But the important point I wanted to get to in understanding this whole idea of Wu, because it gets into confusion. For example, the concept of Qi or Qi, and it gets referred to as like it's like an energy. But I studied Aikido, and according to the school that I studied, well, Qi's not really an energy, it's the way in which energy moves, which is a pretty interesting take on the whole idea of Qi. And so when you study Aikido, you learn to move in a way in which the energy wants to move. And that's why I've seen, like, I knew this one of the principal students here in Detroit. She was about 5'4", and she could go into a bar full of bikers and send them flying all over the place. I mean, really, and she probably weighed about, maybe 115, 120 pounds, soaking wet, But why is that? Why? How can you defend yourself from a samurai sword with a feather? You can see examples of the founder of Aikido, who was able to take coins and flick them and stick them into a tree, because he was able to project so much ki when he threw the coins that they would lodge themselves into the bark in the tree. Well, I challenge you to go try and do that sometime. So there is this whole idea of, which gets into some of the things, the tangents that Cliff gets into with the understanding of Wu, because he's of the opinion, as are many people, that the whole theory of atomic energies is BS, in that it's a question of charging and discharging, that the atomic effect is really more akin to a capacitor in the science of electronics that gets charged up, and when a certain event happens, it allows it to discharge. And that gets into the whole idea of the electrical theory of atomics that Rudolf Steiner makes reference to when he's discussing certain indications regarding occult brotherhoods in England, in occult movements in the 19th century. And so you see that Balfour, there's a paper with Balfour, the famous author of the Balfour Declaration and the founding of Israel and all of that, right? And it was Balfour that made reference to the atom being congealed electricity. And so that's a tangent maybe we can go off in sometime. That'd be a lot of fun. But I know, since you're so interested in Central Asia, that I thought it'd be fun to take a peek down that road. There's so much there, we're not going to see very much. But I have as you know, I'm a hipsisterian by aspiration, and so I revere good achievements of any cultural background, whether they be Christian, pagan, Jewish, Muslim, I don't care. I think that excellence is excellence. I agree with Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. But this whole idea of the high-speed robotic trains, that whole thing is suspect. In case you remember, when the Trans-Siberian Railroad was being put in by the Russians, the Chinese, out of suspicion, made their train tracks of a different gauge, a different width, so that you couldn't just get on a train and load up a train with a bunch of soldiers and then just ride them into China and take them over, which is a smart move on their part. But now what they want to do, they want to put in their trains and have it run all the way to Europe. Well, I think that whole Silk Road plan, I'm not comfortable with that at all. I'm not interested in participating in the Chinese hive mind.
Yeah, I don't think many people in Central Asia were particularly enthusiastic about it either. No, I mean, the train thing is interesting because the last time I heard stories about it, what the engineers were trying to do was interfere in the train's mutual conversation, and they couldn't get a word in because the trains were too busy talking to each other, and the trains haven't told each other to go forward. So they tend to be going in circles and nobody's sure why. So the miracle of engineering. So, yeah, I mean, no, I'm not sure I'm particularly enthused by it, but nevertheless, it's a plan. It's a plan we need to meditate upon on a number of levels and see if it suits everybody involved. I mean, just because it's a Chinese economic initiative doesn't necessarily mean many other people will benefit, and we've got to be careful of that. Yeah, I mean, I love Mircea Eliade. I love Eliade. I mean, somebody told me not too long ago, I love the book on shamanism. I agree, it's a psychological text mostly. Somebody told me a couple of years back that he did it that way because his nagging Roman Catholic wife wouldn't really have it done any other way, because it sounds like it's anti-Catholic. So I don't know if that's just one of those stories or not, but it's a good story. And I suspect there might be some truth to it from what I've heard. Yeah, I mean, the Sky God and, I mean, I never know where to begin when comments of Central Asia come up, because I'm just so in love with the place. I seem to be the sort of passive recipient of experiences every time I'm across there, as opposed to anything else. I mean, I remember we took an afternoon from the University of Osh and went to caves where a shamanic settlement had been over 2,000 years previously. And what they do in that part of the world, because they think Westerners like it, so far Westerners don't tend to go to Central Asia. So I suppose that's wishful thinking on their part. They do mock-ups. You get lots of statues and costumes, so the Westerners will be able to appreciate what it is they're trying to convey. The trouble is, most of the descriptions are in Russian of a particular type, which even Russians find difficult to read. And so nobody's the wiser about anything, which is one of the glories of Central Asia. Food tourism tends to be more at the top of the list in Kyrgyzstan than actual engineering. And certainly people from all over the region travel there for not only the freshness and vitality of the food, the incredible range of flavors, but the health-giving plants in food and outside it that just are abundant everywhere. It's a region that doesn't buckle easily in front of scholarship. I'm thinking of the epic Manas, which is probably the world's oldest and longest poetry epic. It's much, much older than the Mahabharata in India. I know Russian scholars from time to time have attempted to translate it, There always breaks out, and Russians are very good at scholarship when they get the funding and when they get their heads around what it is they're meant to be doing. And it's not actually an ideological battle with the department, which 9 times out of 10 it is. Once they've actually got the green flag and everything fits together, they're very good. I think somebody told me it was when they got up to volume 53 of Manas, they realized their funding was running out. And somebody said, one of the descendants of the shamans actually said, "Oh, you've barely started. There's all this other stuff which we've got to do before we get into the main body of Manas." And so it tends to be one of those bugbears in that part of the world. A treasury of esoteric lore, psychological insights, national heroes, hidden histories. I suspect if people are looking for UFOs and the paranormal, not everybody is and not everybody has to. You even find that there, and not particularly encoded or encrypted because it didn't have to be. It's, when people are talking about the chariots of the gods, to use a phrase from von Daniken, which was actually a very clumsy phrase. I admire the man in many ways, and there's nothing wrong with a new idea. But I read it at school, for God's sake. How old is von Daniken now? I remember reading that at school and thinking, "Oh, that's interesting." But that it wouldn't be that clumsy in Central Asia. The chariots of the gods would mean the chariots of the gods, and they'd find another series of descriptions for aircraft or the risk of being misunderstood, spaceships or whatever it is they're talking about. Which it is they do. I mean, those languages have an elasticity which even Chinese doesn't, which is one of the reasons the poetry is so beautiful, which is one of the reasons the imagery is so deep and rich, and they can draw upon oral traditions. Everything is written down. I suspect in the type of world we're moving into, I hate saying this, but I think everything needs to be written down because we don't know what will happen to these immense cultural treasures in the immediate future. Everything needs to be written down. And in Central Asia, you're looking at not only the beginning of history, you're possibly looking at the echoes of the end of history. There's no point at which it stops. And so, I can't remember who came up with the character Fu Manchu. You've got to help me with that one, John. And you've got to tell me more about this guy and his woo-woo, because I've never heard of him. Have I done this on this show before? I mean, I love Fu Manchu. As some people on this show know, I used to know Christopher Lee. I used to know Sir Chris. And I love his versions of Fu Manchu. In those days, of course, you had the eyes being stretched to show he was Chinese. And he always, in this deadpan way, delivering horrible lines about what he's going to do to Western people, which, of course, is based on strange stories which originate in Central Asia. I'm thinking on a much more serious and elevated level of the books by Madame Alexandra David Neal, who, of course, was arguably, I don't think there's too much of an argument, the first female scholar from Europe. She was French. To go to Tibet. I mean, I don't think there's really an argument with that. If women were so oppressed in the past, and I'm not saying they weren't, it's unwise to think they never did anything of note and value. I mean, this woman, upped and went on her way and explored things that had never been explored before. And certainly some of her books, I mean, The Magic and Mystery in Tibet is an extraordinary book. The Secret Doctrine is that the name of it? Is mind-blowing. And the fact, she catches those cultures at a time when the paranormal is normal. It's ordinary. People don't think of it in terms of the paranormal. The monks don't think of it as paranormal. They think they're just rarefied aspects of the mind, of our behavior. Before I finish that point, I should say I rather do believe there are subtle energies. I know Anglo-American culture doesn't like that view. And the barbaric nature of our present level of discourse is that if it can't be measured, then it's not there. That is barbaric. It doesn't mean we're advanced. It means we're barbaric. And certainly I used to practice, and I've started to practice again, Qigong, all those bloody stretches. My back's given out, my knees have failed. But I remember when I started Qigong, being told by one of the teachers to transfer energy between my tummy and the earth, and it felt like that was happening. I'm not against the notion of subtle energies, and I think simply because they can't be put through a meter at the minute doesn't mean they're not there. It means something else is going on. And certainly Alexandra David Neal, I'm not sure she actually uses that particular phrase, but that's what she's talking about. Discusses, the one story that sticks to mind, I'm trying desperately to fight for the book it's in, is when one of the lamas that she knew was going to meet the king of the world. Not a being that you would hang out with necessarily, in one of the great underground cities, either Shambhala or Agati. And different monks had different opinions on which was which. One was against humanity and its progress. The other was for humanity and its evolution. That in itself is interesting. And Madame Alexandra David Neal, not to catch anybody out, made a rose out of paper and said, "Give that to the king of the world," when the monk met him. A couple of weeks later, the monk came back with a blue rose. Now, it was in the middle of the Tibetan winter. No one could move, let alone get flowers at that time into that region. And there are no blue roses. And the monk said, the king of the world was grateful for the gift and had transformed it into a living flower to present back to the good madam. Interesting stories that make no sense on a rational level, if that's what they're designed to do, but point to something. Let's go to power-hungry manipulators. One of the stories that comes to mind from the autobiography of Mao Zedong. No, it's not John Cena. There was actually a guy called Mao Zedong who writes about the Long March. They were going through that particular region, and all this bizarre stuff starts to happen. Paranormal activity, globes in the sky, what he calls crypto. I don't translate from Chinese. I don't know if that's a good word. Electrical outbursts, and the soldiers say there are a group of monks in a cave nearby, and they're causing it all. So Mao Zedong himself went with some of the Red Guard and basically gave them an ultimatum: this has to stop, or I'll have you all gunned down. In his autobiography, he says very clearly it didn't stop. So with the usual subtle hand of the Chinese, the Red Guard went in and mowed them all down. These stories, whether Anglo-American culture likes it or not, cannot be simply swept away. They cannot be simply dismissed. They cannot be reduced. They cannot be minimized, because no one can say the Chinese don't know what they're talking about. Their level of technology and mathematics is easily comparable to anything in the West. They do have a different mindset. We need to bear that in mind, of what that means and what that implies. But certainly we can't say that vicious power brokers like Mao Zedong, who have got no reason to add that little anecdote at all, apart from the fact his publisher probably said, keep it in, Mao, that'll sell a few more copies. There's no reason for it to be there, but it is. And I don't think ethnographers, anthropologists like Madame Alexandra David Neal can be poo-pooed. I think the new battleground, then I'll hand back to you, John, is actually, in terms of metaphysics, is actually what lots of people like to write up as woo-woo. What is happening and what is it? And to reduce it all to psychology or simply misunderstandings. A very eminent friend of mine said to me a couple of years ago, "Oh, it's all just what the brain does," to which I couldn't help replying, "But that's true of everything. But you haven't answered a thing by saying that." Yet we can't dismiss the Red Guard being taken off of a military march for no logical reason whatsoever to take action which they felt was necessary in a political campaign leading to a war. That doesn't happen. And we can't dismiss the French Academy of Sciences because let's face it, they're normally ahead of what the Anglo-Americans are doing when it comes to ethnology and anthropology, and we need to listen to them a bit more. I don't like the sound of this woo-woo guy. I don't like dismissive gestures. Tell us more, John. Tell us more.
Well, yeah. I thought I sent you some links to some of his stuff. It's quite fascinating. He's interesting character, but I don't want to get. It's too easy to get diverted. Here's something for you. This could be classified as woo. Okay, so what you have here is these are from Russia, from Siberia, and we have soapstone. That's this one, and this one is shungite. Yeah. And so you hold them in your hands. You'll see Egyptian statues where you look and they're holding things like this in their hands, right? And it has to do with that principle of charge, discharge, and the idea of polarity. And just by holding these in my hand, I can feel my hands tingling from the energy exchange between them. And this is a topic. There's other rods, like, for example, there's Count Stefan Kolono-Waluski, who wrote a book on Caucasian yoga, a result of two teachers that he met in the Caucasus Mountains, and they showed him how to make these rods, one of which was magnetic, and using that for healing purposes and in combination with mantras and all that. And it's said that it's a tradition that leads back to Egypt. He's an interesting character because he's of the family of Kolono-Waluski, who is of the family of one of the brides of the Emperor Napoleon. And but he ran an occult bookstore in New York, in the Big Apple. The Big Woo, I guess the Big Malum, Magnum Malum, the Big Evil. But there's anything you can imagine. Maybe someday we'll do an episode on Caucasian yoga. He's a fascinating character. And I assume you're familiar with him? Yeah, you are. Okay, good. I have a first edition of it here somewhere. It's like on this parchment paper and all that, you know. A lot of cool things. Anyways, you know, it's funny because it's like the shifting sands. I can't even talk. You know, when things that I have show up and then disappear and then reappear. There you go. I made reference to the biography of Tycho Brahe, Lord of Uraniborg. That is the book on Tycho Brahe in English. I'm sure there's perhaps even better books in Danish, but I can't read Danish. And but I wanted to get back to some of this woo thing before we run out of time, because first off, if it's interesting to note, and that if you write the ideogram in Chinese for woo, it's like that. It's like an I with those two, like they look like wishbones from a turkey, but you could interpret the two of them combined, make an M. So it's like it mysteriously is I am, even though that has nothing to do with what the Chinese think it means. It's just a curious coincidence. But there was an article by a guy from the Department of Religion at Boston University, Thomas Michael, that was in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, and it's called Shamanism Theory and the Early Chinese Woo. And it's an examination of what we were just discussing. And I'll give you a brief from the beginning. This article undertakes a re-examination of shamanism in early China, an issue that centers on a religious title, Wu, that is consistently mentioned in virtually every major text from the period. For roughly the last 50 years, sinologists, that's people who study China, have vigorously argued the appropriateness of identifying these Wu as shamans. In an effort to bring deeper degree of clarity to this issue. Parts 1 or 2 of the article explore certain findings from the field of modern shaman studies that could open up new ways of thinking about the woo. Part 3 examines the way in which sinologists have approached the woo and attempts to show how modern shaman theory can allow us to better situate our thinking on the issue. And Part 4 offers a brief case study of one early Chinese text and considers how modern shaman theory can shed new light on our interpretation of the woo. So there's been considerable amount of energy put out into trying to figure out what exactly is this woo. And so, but I don't know that Cliff Eye knows about these things, but he's so comprehensive. But the other day he was saying that, you know, he's been trying to figure out China, and he said he can't wrap his head around it. It's very, very difficult. Again, going back to the whole thing about Jonathan Livingston Seagull, you know, it's like they translated that into Chinese. And so you say their whole approach to language with when you start getting into Mandarin Chinese, for example, you've got a language that consists of over 100,000 characters. Okay, well, that's like a proprietary language. It's like if you don't know it, you don't know it. And so they could send messages to each other, and the only people that can read them are people that can read Mandarin, period. And you can be sure that some of the leading Mandarin scholars are Jesuits. And so there's this whole idea of stratification of society in China through language. Well, we have that. You have that in the UK. I mean, really, there's a social ladder in Britain that has to do with that. All they do is have to hear you say something, and they can tell you what level of society you're at by the way you speak, you know. And people aspire to speak posh, you know. They like to be part of the upper crust instead of perhaps Cockney or you know, some of the other dialects. And so it's interesting. Personally, I think that the Irish have a more eloquent use of language oftentimes than the British. I mean, some of your Irish writers, A.E. William Butler Yeats, even James Joyce, they have more of a lyrical tilt, such as like Lord Dunsany's, the prose. It can only be called prosody because it's almost a versification of the language. And Lord Dunsany, a distant relation of mine, but he's the father of fantasy stories. Him and George MacDonald. George MacDonald, like another, and just incredible stories by George MacDonald. Do look him up. They're absolutely beautifully written, and any good Waldorf teacher that worth their salt is familiar with the stories of George MacDonald. They're some of the greatest stories you could read to children. But anyways, we get off the topic so often here that sometimes I think our topic is to be off the topic, and which is okay. That's the kind of freedom that we like to have. You know, there was a particular vantage point that I was investigating for today, but I decided that I'll let that sit on the shelf for another episode, so we have something to look forward to. And you're going to have to guess what that is, because I'm not going to give you any clues. But in speaking about these things and in trying to get into that whole comment I made about ki and the way in which energy moves, that's not to say that ki isn't energy. But, and see, that's the trouble that Westerners have with ideographic language, because see, there's levels of meaning that are revealed through the context in which they're used. And that's, if you get into studying language, it's very interesting. Like, for example, Latin they use in law because it's a dead language. It doesn't change because, you know, it's the language of the Roman Empire and the language of certain patristic studies and the language of the church fathers and all of that in the West. the church fathers in the East spoke Greek. Well, in speaking Greek, they use that in science because you can morph it very, very effectively. You could take this part of a word connected with this other part, and you can make a new term. So they name new animals that are discovered. They use Greek, but Latin they use in law because words have very specific meanings that don't change. The change of meaning of a word has entirely to do with the context in which it's placed within the language. And so if you learn Latin, it will think in you. And if you pursue philosophical subjects, then it's kind of frightening in a way to think that if you pursue philosophy using the Latin language, that your philosophical conclusions will be determined by grammar.
That one caught me. That's probably why the Romans never flew as high as the Greeks when it comes to philosophy. Yeah, you're worried about ice cream. I'm worried about my Sunday roast. Every time this show begins, I find myself silently burping and hopefully erupting, and hopefully nobody sees it. But I think enough people have got to see it nowadays, so there we are. I don't care. Yes, we had a nice chicken roast before the show began. In terms of class and language usage, I mean, I don't know if you've heard of them. I love carry-on movies. I mean, in Britain, they're almost like sort of a tribal initiation. The costume carry-on movies are the best one, costume comedies. And the actors were nearly invariably the same. I mean, you get Sid James in Carry On Up the Khyber as Sir Sidney Rough Diamond, who's the Viceroy of India for Her Majesty Victoria, and Joan Sims. It's not often I get tongue-tied. A couple of years, 20 years or so ago, I was walking down Great Marlborough Street and Joan Sims got out of her limo and I nearly passed out. Oh my God, it's Joan Sims, the actress, the comedian. I could think of nothing to say. One of the worst things that's ever happened. She played Lady Rough Diamond in this wonderful film. And obviously they're two people out of place and from the wrong class. There's a polo match with Randy Lal, the evil, plotting Indian leader, and Joan Sims, watching the polo, forgive me, says, "Here, he didn't half crack that one." When you get somebody knocking the polo ball, to which Sir Sidney Rough Diamond says, "If her ladyship can't express herself more gracefully, I suggest she shuts her cake hole," which might be very British, but it's worth every minute of struggling with. Is there? I think in many ways this British society, mirrors China. I mean, you get endless exams if you want to go up the civil service. You have to promise to care about nothing apart from the monarch. That strikes me as Chinese. Remember, ministers come and go, but civil servants last forever. I mean, that strikes me as Chinese. And yeah, I mean, they don't know where to place me, to give a little personal reflection for a minute, because I can be what they call plummy. I can say things in the correct way, but I tend to say them with a Hampshire intonality, and sometimes a tiny bit of Welsh. Therefore, they're not quite sure what to make of me. And good. That's what I say, good. Keep guessing. Ha, 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 ha. I'm a plebeian and I'm proud of it, you swines. So there we are. But they find it difficult if they don't know me to place the social level. I wish all that would go. The poison of British society is the class system. It will continue to poison this country's cultural life until it's gone. I'm one of the few people that thinks it needs to go. Therefore, it's in no worry. It's in no hurry and no worry. And it's going to be here a very long time, because that terrible human need for one human being to lord it over another isn't going to go anytime soon, even though it's a matter of gross spiritual immaturity, but it's not going anywhere in a hurry. So that's British society for you and some of the linguistic mysteries therein. In terms of China, I always tended to admire China from a very insecure distance. I mean, I mentioned not too long ago that some of the Kazakh poets, I mean, Mukhtar Shakhanov is my very, very dear friend. He won the Nobel Prize for Poetry in 1990. He's a legend in that part of the world. He fills stadiums as a poet. I wish the rest of us could do that. I remember going to his office when the Soviet Union collapsed. So did all of the local economies. That's not so good. Okay, you got yours, Ivan, you got yours, Ivan, but people forgot there was a ripple-on effect, which was really horrible. And my dear friend had bought this entire building, which was his office, for basically a couple of pounds. And that sounds like a steal, as they used to say, like a steal or like a bargain, but it wasn't. It was a sign of terrible economic disasters that spread across the entire region. I remember the last time I was there looking at the snowy mountains through his plate glass walls, because that was one of the Soviets' advances in sort of architecture, and looking at these breathtaking, huge snowy mountains, and him saying censoriously to me, "China's the other side of that," with me thinking, oh my God, and we're both nervous that China is the other side of those mountains. So, yeah, I mean, without giving away names, I mean, I have the privilege of knowing probably the greatest living poet in Russia. I was at a dinner party in Kyrgyzstan a couple of years ago. They prefer to speak in Russian. I got a couple of phrases in Russian. Shame on me, I should have learned it by now. And the poet eventually turning around to me and saying in English, "We expect the West to stand by us," I'm paraphrasing, "in our hour of need. You've left us in the grip of China." And I actually didn't know what to say. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, there wasn't a power vacuum, but there was a massive rearranging of power bases across the region. And actually, one of the feelings in Moscow at that particular time, I believe it's still one of the feelings, is that we actually let them down. We were so busy scoring points, we actually weren't seeing what was happening. And anyone that's interested in politics knows it doesn't take years. It happens in seconds. That is actually what we've done to them. Lots of people in Moscow are still angry and still upset that we're still not rising to that challenge. But that's, because you're dealing with a nation of traders in China, and I'm not against the Chinese, and they do make me nervous. But an incredible culture, a wonderful culture. But let's face it, the old saying of the Jews of the East, I mean, that's what they used to be called in Europe. And the fact they can only think in terms of, in the plans they've outlined recently, in terms of what is tantamount to economic conquest. These things are not trivial, and we've got to think, this isn't the Cold War. Things have moved on, come up to date. British and American politicians are the worst, talking about a series of scenarios that's gone. It's never going to come back. We're in a different world now, facing different challenges, and those challenges are getting more powerful by the year. More than that, I don't want to say, apart from the fact that maybe we need to be more sensitive, not only to the past of these beautiful, wonderful cultures, but the present and what may count as a very draining future for us all if we're not careful. I know this isn't a politics show. I apologize, John. I'm going to belch again any second anyway. I'm envious of the ice cream. I'm envious of all the people you know. I'm envious of all the books. What can I say? Game, set and match. Poor me. But I'll hand. And yet now I know who you mean. You sent those clips. And I was thinking, who on earth is that man? And vacuous points about nothing in particular. Anyway, I'll hand you back.
Well, that's when you get into scholarly studies, you have to wade through a great deal. And one of my old favorites from back 30 years ago, William Irwin Thompson, a good friend of David Spangler and the people at Findhorn. But Thompson used to talk about the hothouse flowers of academia, that they're really good at talking to each other. And if you're not a member of the club, you probably won't even understand what they're talking about. But yeah, he passed on. God rest his soul. Did I hear Judi Dench is related to Tycho de Brahe? No, I didn't know that. Now, that's interesting. Yeah, he's a real firebrand with his artificial nose he had tied onto his ears. That he got it cut off in a duel. I want to do another episode about him now that I've discovered the material, some of the more of the materials that I have on him. He's one of my favorite figures. But we keep getting off the track here, but I guess that's what makes what we do interesting, is that we get off the track. But I'm still in a quandary about the whole idea of the Chinese installing different sized train tracks so that the Russians couldn't ride trains into their country, and now they want to cross the whole world with these robot trains that sound to me like weapons more than anything else. You say if they drive in circles, well, elemental beings love going in circles. They love that. That's one of the few pleasures they have, is curvilinear movement. But anyways, that's, again, getting too far afield on that. I didn't want to get to the end of our show without sharing with you some of the works of Reverend David William Parry, his Shakespearean study, The Grammar of Witchcraft. And no, it's not a grimoire. Although it's quite magical in its thinking, it will not help you cast spells. At least I don't think it will. And his Shakespearean-esque poetry, Caliban's Redemption. He insists that's not a picture of him. I don't know. It looks like they got a lot more hair than you do. And his major work, Mount Athos Inside Me, Essays on Religion, Swedenborg and the Arts, edited by Daniela Irandust, very talented editor. This book is very wonderfully received by the critics and scholars. He writes in beautiful lyrical language. You'd think he was Irish or something. But all those books are available on Amazon, and I heartily recommend them. And for myself, my first book, I keep saying I'm going to get out an unfaded copy, but I keep pulling up this same old worn out copy of mine, The Arcana of the Grail Angel, the Spiritual Science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner and the underground streams of esoteric Christianity, which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail to the Order of the Knights Templar and the true Rosicrucian Order. And it includes a foreword by my good friend Douglas Gabriel from American Intelligence Media and numerous other platforms, and 640 pages of studies of the Grail that's kind of picking up where Walter Johannes Stein left off, who wrote the 9th century world history in the light of the Holy Grail, he was the mentor of one of my mentors. And so, or a couple of my mentors, actually, because there's René Carrido also, but Werner Glass, who referred to Douglas as his right hand, so that we have a very close relationship with that stream. My second book is The Arcana of Light on the Path, which is more of a meditative text based on Mabel Collins' Light on the Path, which I discerned had a 22 stanza structure, and then so I started comparing the stanzas with the images of the tarot symbolism, and found that they harmonize perfectly. And so personally, I'm of the theory that that's supposed to be that way, and that it's not that one is copying the other, but that they have a common spiritual archetypal stream of which they evolve from. But in any regards, whatever your theories are on that, it doesn't really matter, because the truth is the truth, irrespective of opinion. But in here is a great many symbols that will help you. If I go through this slow enough, you'll see that there's a great deal of esoteric content available in these works. The whole series of diagrams in Arcana of the Grail Angel is reproduced in this book, plus there's a whole bunch of additional diagrams. So there's more diagrams in my second book, and they're available on eBay. You can buy them directly from me. If you go somewhere in some of the used book sites, you may end up paying a lot more money for a used copy. But that's in the United States. They're available on eBay. If you want to get them and you're outside the country, I've sent them to a lot of different countries. You can get a hold of me personally, and you can reach me through private message on Facebook, or I have the academia link listed below, and you can send me a message through there. If you want to buy a cup of coffee or make some contributions towards our humble efforts here, David's is paypal.me/dparry777, and mine is paypal.me/John Barnwell 888. And by the way, stop by my Twitter account at John Barnwell 888, and you can see the thread of hundreds of connecting the dots regarding the Crown Gate. That I have that parked at the top of my Twitter account, although I don't post. The only posts I make over there are now these podcasts that I do here, and I don't get that much traffic. But at one time, I got over 2.5 million impressions until they realized I was there, and then they put a lid on it. And now, who knows if those tallies are real or what. I'll be checking on my shows here, and then I'll notice over a period of a half an hour that the count of people that watched it went down by 5. So don't they have anything better to do than shave 5 views off of my videos? I don't know. So go figure, whatever that means. It's beyond me that there's this patrolling of minutia for people with small minds is the only way I can look at it. But I'm so glad that we're here once again, and I'm glad to have you all here. And you're here on the 64th Full Circle show as Agatha Velvet. It's Agatha. That's like Agartha. That's like Darth Vader. Oh no. In any regards, we're of the ilk to where we like to have David share a prayer with us. Of course, my favorite is when he does the Pater Noster.
I will come up with some old Celtic prayers for next week. But I like ending the show with the Pater Noster, to be honest. So, my dear friends, bow your heads for a few moments, bow your hearts for a few moments in prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you, Reverend David, and thank you, everybody, for showing up. And hello to people that'll see this later. And this podcast is made possible by Tyla and Vadim and a handful of other people. And so I want to give a heartily thanks to them and go to American Intelligence Media and check out a lot of the research that's being done. And the Americans for Innovations, that's the number 4, just like aim for truth, the number 4. And so that being said, thank you, everybody.